So, Glorious Kev put out a video a couple of months ago, and it was to basically show off a $600 PC that you could buy at the time, and I have some issues with it. Um, just to put it out there, Glorious Kev's a great guy. I think he is very knowledgeable in this stuff, but I think he missed the mark on this one quite severely, and I'm gonna explain why and go over like the problems with his build and the reason why I would choose different parts, and I'll show off those parts. So this is the build that Kev basically created for $600, and in fact, it went slightly over $600. I believe at the time it went to about $606, I believe, at the end. And I can't agree with some of these parts. Now, I'm going to break down each one as we go through. Okay, so the graphics card that he picks is the 6500 XT. Now, I don't know if Kev knows this, but the 6500 XT is a terrible card. It was speculation that it was originally meant to be designed for laptop GPUs, but then was made into a desktop. And the reason why we think that is because it runs on a PCI Express Gen 4x4 interface. And that comes up very, very importantly later on. But basically what that means is anything that isn't using a Gen 4 lane or Gen 4 slot is going to have massive performance issues. And this was actually shown off by multiple different outlets. Gamers Nexus, Linus Tech Tips, a bunch of different ones that got their hands on this card. It can be anywhere between like 20 to 50% slower, simply because the bus is 50% slower. A Gen 3 bus is 50% slower than a Gen 4 bus. So there's some issues there. Now you might be wondering, what did I pick? So I went with a 6600. Now the 6600, while still not the best card on the market, is still a really good card. Now, I have spent a little bit more on this, but there is a reason for that, and that reason is basically it's a significantly better card. Now, where we're putting more money into this, we're actually saving money in other places, and that will be very significant. But let's continue.
To pair this with the CPU, I'm going to filter this for Ryzen 3. I'm going to filter it for i3s.
Now, this is a good idea for this sort of budget, but personally, if I was to truly recommend someone building something like this, I'd probably ask them to have a look at older machines, probably an older i5 or an older i7, going back as maybe like 4th gen. As shown by Linus Tech Tips in one of their as shown in one of their videos in a few months ago, or I think about a year ago now, basically everything 4th gen upwards is still not bottlenecking anything from like a 3060 Ti type of graphics card. And with a 6600 or even a 6500 XT, you're not at that level already. So going for something that's 4th gen or 6th gen, absolutely fine.
So we're going to do something, like I said, a little more entry level. This 10100F, and it's $40 cheap.
The 10100F is actually a very good pick here. However, it is only 4 cores and it is 8 threads. The one thing you will need to know is it doesn't have dedicated graphics. So anyone who's building this build or a similar build needs to remember that you will need a graphics card for this. Unless you're going for a 10100, which is about $30 more. It's not really worth it. At that point, you might as well go up to about a 12th gen and get a better CPU there.
Cheaper than that. So I think we go with Intel cooler, so I'm going to save a couple bucks there.
And just to reiterate that point, I did actually choose the 10100F for my own build as well. It is just a really good CPU, and if you can get it on certain websites, you can get it as low as like $60. It's really cheap and a really good CPU for just that price, and I think most people should get it if they are looking for a very budget build.
And this is kind of how you just piece out part out a PC. You know, the motherboards are also always going to be a little pricey for this kind of budget. I think all of these motherboards.
Now, this is one thing that I did change on the motherboard side. Kev here goes for a B560M, and I actually went for the one below it, the H510M. This is simply because of, at the time, this was the cheapest option. Generally, when it comes to motherboards, you shouldn't really mind. There are two things that you should really look for, but not at this level. The two things you generally look for are compatibility with the stuff you want. So does it have M.2s? Does it have enough USB ports? Does it have Wi-Fi? Those sort of things. And the other thing is VRM cooling. Now, the VRM cooling doesn't really matter at this level at an i3, but it will do if you ever upgrade to a higher end CPU later down the line to like an i5, i7, or even an i9. Though personally, I probably wouldn't use one of these motherboards for an i9. VRM cooling comes into very big play at those levels because the VRMs are pushing so much current through them that they get very hot and they can actually thermal throttle. And this was actually shown off by a video by David Does Stuff on an older Intel CPU, not even one of the newer ones, which has even higher voltages and higher current levels. It's just a bad idea to have one without good VRM cooling.
We're going to pick some memory. I want to start at 32 gigs. I don't think anybody building a PC, like, you can get away with buying 16 gigs of RAM these days, but we're headed toward 32 being the kind of like the staple.
This is completely wrong. I'm sorry, Kev, but this is absolutely incorrect. Out of all the games out there at the moment, only about 3 or 4 actually use more than 16 gigs. These are Escape from Tarkov, Microsoft Flight Simulator, and some VR games. Very, very few. I think Half-Life Alyx at some stage can if you're at like the maximum settings. At this level, you do not need 32 gigs. And in fact, as shown by another Linus Tech Tips video recently, you sometimes can get away with 8 gigs. Like, you don't even need 16 on most things. You can actually get away with 8. So I completely disregard this entire point. I think this is completely wrong. And as well as that, the kit that you chose for 32 gigs is a very bad kit of RAM. And I'm going to explain why. So let's just skip to the actual kit that he picks. Okay, so he's picked up this G-Skill Ripjaws V32 gig kit. Now, I would not pick this kit, and the reason I would not pick this kit is because, one, it's running at DDR4 2666. Now, on Intel's side, you don't need to matter about frequency as much, but the reason I'm bringing this up is because it has a CAS latency of 19. Now, some of you might not know what CAS latency is, but basically there is a calculation that is done between the CAS latency and the frequency to work out this, the first word latency. And this is the biggest thing when it comes to RAM. People don't really understand how RAM works. People just go, oh, it's 3200 speed, I'm going to go for that. Or 3600. The thing you need to really look at is first word latency, because this is going to determine how actually fast your RAM is in the real world. This is the biggest reason why DDR5 still has not become the biggest mainstream thing. While its frequency is massive, its CAS latency is also huge, in the order of magnitude larger. It's going somewhere around 36 is like the highest, or like the fastest you can get. And so the first word latency is not as good. This is why it's only good for like productivity stuff. For stuff like gaming, this RAM would be significantly worse than this Team Group T-Force Zeus 32 gigs kit, because its first word latency is much lower. Generally, for RAM, you want to look at, or at least DDR4 RAM, you want to look at stuff like CL16 or CL18, depending on the RAM speed. Now, I picked this Silicon Power 16 gig kit, which is DDR4 3000 at CL16. this gives it a first word latency of about 10.667. And if you notice, this is actually faster than the 14.254 that he picked up. While it is only 16 gigs, again, you do not need 32 gigs, and that's absolute truth. And that is coming from someone who has 32 gigs of RAM in their system. Let's get on with the rest of it.
Power supply and case as well. And then we'll base how much storage we have after we have all the required pieces.
Doing this is actually a good idea. Basing your storage off of how much you've got left after everything is actually probably the best thing to do, because storage is the most, other than like RAM and a graphics card, is one of the most easy to upgrade, especially if you just want to go for like external hard drives, or if you've already got external hard drives or SSDs or stuff like that. Generally, you can pry out, like if you've got an old laptop, you can generally just take out the old drive, as long as it's not a soldered SSD.
The H510, it's a well-known case. It always does great for budget builds. That is the kind of...
This is kind of not the best idea. Just because a case is popular does not mean that it should matter in a budget build. I actually went for a Rosewell FBM X1 micro ATX case. Rosewell is a decent brand for very cheap builds and very cheap things. And the reason why I picked it is because it has two things. One, it has front USB 3, which is good and general. Two, it is the right size for our motherboard, which is micro ATX. This is generally the motherboard size you're going to go for. Now, is it as flashy as a H510? No, but at a budget this low, you really shouldn't be caring about how it looks. The case should be one of the last things you actually care about, as long as it is a case that will work with what you've got. I don't think going for a H510 is a very good idea at this stage. You may want to transfer everything over to something like a H510 later when you've got a bit more of a budget. And I would suggest going for a better case later on when you have a more higher budget. But at this stage, if you're under a certain amount of dollars, you should not be looking at very fancy cases or even mid-tier cases like the H510.
The budget king, in my opinion, for cases. Power supply, 255 watts. I always like to go for a little more than what I need. So while you only need 255, I'm going to try to go for 600 and 650.
Okay, this is not wrong. Generally speaking, you want to hit like the 80% load on your power supply for longevity generally. You don't ever want to go for like, if you're on 255 watts, you don't want to go for like a 300 watt because of voltage spikes and current spikes. They can be your bane of existence. Now, if you have the budget, you probably want to go for something that's about double the wattage. But for something that's lower end, I would go for anything from 60 to 80% load. And so for me, I actually went for a 600 watt power supply. Similar to Kev, I also went for sort of double the wattage. If you look up here, it's 301 watts. But personally, I don't really like the wattage that they use on PC Part Picker. So personally, I would use something like the Outer Vision Power Supply Calculator. This is a lot more in depth, and it looks into stuff like USB devices and the number of fans and stuff like that as well. And if you look at this, it's generally about 405 watts. That's 100 watts difference, right? When you actually have stuff plugged in. So personally, I wouldn't use this. It's not the best thing in the world. It will give you a general idea, but not the best idea. At 405 watts, a 600 watt power supply is about 2/3, or it is 405 watts is 2/3 of 600 watts. That's about where we want to be. That's 66%.
EVGA makes great products again. 80 plus gold certified, 650 watts.
Efficiency ratings aren't everything. Just because something is an 80 plus gold doesn't necessarily mean it's a good power supply. Now, while I am a fan of EVGA power supplies, I just need to put that out there and say that just because something is an 80 plus gold does not mean it is a great power supply. Now, I do know for a fact he's going to go and pick this GA power supply. At $60, it's probably okay, but realistically, we're on a budget here. 80 plus bronze is absolutely fine, and going for something like this VS600 is probably going to be better overall for this initial build. Again, you may want to upgrade later to something better, but generally you want to make some savings and put stuff into other places that make more sense. Stuff like the CPU and, in my case, the graphics card and storage.
See, we're at 562 now. And now the last thing we are going to need is storage. And now we have about $40 more or less for storage. So
something that I forgot to mention, the reason why I didn't like the 6500 XT is because he picked out a B560 motherboard. That is limited to PCIe Express 3.0. And as I mentioned earlier, with a motherboard that's with that speed of a slot, it will not get the full speed out of a RX 5600 XT. So I don't think it's a very good card for it.
So let's see here, we're going to go ahead and we'll price filter down to storage, down to say about $40-50. If I go a little over, that's fine too. I'm trying to keep it in that range. I don't want traditional storage at this point, I only want SSDs.
While for a boot drive, absolutely, you shouldn't actually be using hard drives anymore. I don't see the point in using hard drives anymore for a boot drive. They're absolutely too slow. I can kind of still see why a hard drive would be used for mass storage. Now, in his case, he doesn't really have the budget for something like that, but in his case, I would probably go for something like a 120 or a 240 gig SSD, and then get something of a hard drive, maybe a 500 gig hard drive, just so that you have the additional storage. While it's not going to be as good, it will at least be there. Now, he's going to go ahead and pick a Crucial P2 500 gigabyte, a very good SSD. It is M.2, which is a lot better than SATA, but the problem with it is it's only 500 gigabytes. Games now are way, way bigger than that, with some of them almost getting to the 200 gig mark. And once you've taken away the provisioning from Windows and Windows itself, you're probably going to be left with about 400 gigs. This is not a lot of storage unless you're playing the most light titles. So personally, I went with a 500 gig MX500 Crucial drive. And by the way, this is a drive with a cache, which does matter. Because if you don't have a cache, it can be slower than a hard drive, and a 1 terabyte Seagate Barracuda. I've used these drives before. They are reliable in my experience. They're not the best drives in the world, but they at least work. They do what they need to do, and they're not a high price. So, overall, Kev's build ends up being about $605.91. My PC comes out to $599.22. Now, granted, that is with a $20 mail-in rebate from the graphics card, but that shouldn't really matter. At $620 overall, it's only about $25 more than Kev's build, and it is significantly better because it's got way more storage, it has a better graphics card, and it just will be better. These are more important than a nice case or a super nice power supply or 32 gigs of RAM, which it is not needed. So, Kev, while I respect your attempt at making a PC build, and I respect the fact that you are putting out the correct information of stuff like the power supply being you should be arguably double the wattage simply to work on overhead, that sort of stuff, you're absolutely correct. But the build you actually created and recommended to people for $600 is just not a very good build. And if you want to discuss this, I know you have me on Twitter. I have you. And please, again, this is no ill will to Glorious Kev. I think he's a great guy. I just don't think he didn't do the correct research for this video. And I think that you can get a better build for less money overall, or even if you do pay the extra $30, it's a significantly better build to the point where I would recommend that over the one he did. So, Kev, if you want to have a discuss about this, please let me know. Other than that, see you guys later.